For 24 years, in a frozen corner of the Soviet Arctic, a team of scientists did something almost no one noticed. They drilled a hole straight down into the planet, not for oil, not for minerals, just to see how deep a human being could reach. They went deeper than anyone ever had, and deeper than the bottom of the ocean, deeper than any mine, until the rock around the drill was older than complex life itself. And down there, in the dark, they found things the textbooks had promised would not be there. Then, with thousands of kilometers of planet still beneath them, they stopped. They did not stop because of anything supernatural. They stopped because the Earth itself had become too strange to continue. You have probably heard a story about this hole, a story about microphones lowered into the ground and the screams of the damned recorded rising out of it. That story is a lie, and we will show you exactly where it came from. The truth is quieter, and it is far more unsettling. This is the long archives, where we separate what actually happened from the legend that grew over it. If you want the real science kept clean from the myth, subscribe and stay to the end. There is a new entry every Sunday. In the second half of the 20th century, two superpowers were racing in every direction at once. We remember the race upward, the rockets, the moon. But there was another race, almost forgotten now, and it ran the opposite way, downward. The reasoning was simple and beautiful. We had walked on another world before we had ever seen our own planet's crust from the inside. Everything beneath our feet, the layers of rock, the heat, the chemistry of the deep, was known only indirectly, guessed at from earthquakes and theory. To actually drill into it would be to read the Earth's history the way you read the rings of a tree, layer by layer, downward through time. The Americans tried first. Their plan was clever. Rather than drill through the thick continental crust, they would drill through the much thinner crust beneath the deep ocean floor, hoping to reach the boundary with the mantle by the shortest path down. They sank a few experimental holes off the coast in the early 1960s and proved it could be done, and then watched the effort drown in cost overruns and politics until it was cancelled in 1966. The most ambitious target in the history of drilling had been abandoned before it truly began. So the ambition passed to the Soviet Union, and in 1970, on the Kola Peninsula near the Norwegian border, Soviet engineers began. Their target was breathtaking, 15,000 meters, 15 kilometers, into the continental crust. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing feel impossible. The hole they planned to drill, kilometers deep into solid rock, would be only about 23 centimeters wide, narrower than a dinner plate. They were going to thread a needle straight down into the body of the planet.
All right, bring her down slow. Easy
Drilling
now,
that
almost
deep
there.
is nothing like the image most of us
Set the
carry.
clamps, secure
There
the
was
pipe.
no vast pit, no widening shaft. There was a single slender bore, and at the bottom of a column of pipe kilometers long, a drill turned in the dark. The engineering problems multiplied with every meter. A rigid pipe that long cannot simply be spun from the surface. It would twist and shatter. So the Soviets used a clever solution, a turbine at the very bottom, driven by drilling fluid pumped down from above, so that only the cutting head turned while the pipe stayed
right, slowly
still.
bring it up.
Periodically, they would haul
the
the
guides,
entire
watch the guides.
column to the surface to
Clear.
recover a
Rack
core
it back.
sample, a cylinder of rock
This
from the
coloration
depths,
suggests
and to change the
significant
worn bit.
oxidation.
Near the end, a single
It's
round
unusual
trip
for
of the
this
drill string could take most of a day just to travel down and back. Around the borehole grew a small scientific settlement. Laboratories, workshops, housing, a whole community of geologists and engineers who would spend much of their careers on this one descending line. The work was painstaking and slow, measured not in meters a day, but sometimes in meters a week. Each hard-won core was carried up from a depth that existed nowhere else on Earth and studied as if it were a relic, because in a sense, it was a piece of a world no human instrument had ever touched directly. For years it worked. The bore crept downward through the ancient rock of the Baltic Shield, some of the oldest stone on the surface of the Earth. The samples that came up were studied like treasure, because each one was a piece of a world no instrument had ever touched directly. And almost immediately, those samples began to argue with the predictions. The deeper they went, the clearer it became that the simple, layered picture of the crust, the neat diagram in every school book, was wrong in ways no one had expected. The planet, red from the inside, was not behaving according to the plan. It took the world record in 1979, passing 9,500 meters and overtaking an American gas well in Oklahoma that had held the title before. From there, Kola was alone, drilling into ground no one had ever reached. By the early 1980s, it was, without question, the deepest hole ever made by human beings, and it kept going. But the deeper it went, the more savagely the planet fought the machine. And in the autumn of 1984, it nearly ended the project in a single afternoon. With the bore at just over 12,000 meters, the drill string twisted apart under the enormous strain. A 5-kilometre length of pipe, kilometers of steel, broke off and was lost, abandoned at the bottom of the hole, impossible to recover. Years of work were sealed away in an instant beneath a plug of ruined metal. The team had no choice but to back up and begin again, re-drilling from around 7,000 meters, carving a fresh branch down through rock they had already conquered once. It would cost them 5 more years to win back the depth they had lost in that one failure. And to push, at last, just past it. By the time it recovered, Kola had become quietly famous in scientific circles. Researchers traveled from around the world to study its cores. It hosted international geological gatherings. For a window in the 1980s, this remote Arctic borehole was one of the most important scientific instruments on the planet. It was a Soviet achievement, but the knowledge it pulled up belonged to everyone, a rare thread of open science running through the middle of the Cold War. What the Kola hole found in the end was not a monster. It was a series of quiet shocks, each one rewriting a line of the textbook. The first was water. Far down, in rock that should have been bone dry, the scientists found water, free water, circulating through cracks kilometers below the surface, where the pressure should have squeezed every pore shut. The explanation, when it came, was its own small marvel. The water had been forced out of the minerals themselves by the crushing pressure and then trapped in place by a lid of impermeable rock above. There was a hidden water world down there, sealed away, that no theory had predicted. The second shock was older than the dinosaurs, older than fish. At a depth of around 6 kilometers, in rock, roughly 2 billion years old, the samples held microfossils, the remains of tiny, single-celled organisms, 24 species of ancient plankton, preserved in stone far below the reach of any root or burrow. Life's signature, pressed into the deep rock of a younger Earth. The third shock was an absence. Geologists had long believed that a certain boundary in the crust, a line where earthquake waves suddenly sped up, marked the place where one kind of rock, granite, gave way to another, basalt. The Kola hole drilled straight through that boundary, and the basalt was simply not there.
It means we found something
What the
new,
boundary
doesn't
actually
it?
marked was not a change of rock at all, but the same granite, cracked and transformed and soaked with that deep water. A feature taught as settled fact in every geology course turned out to be something else entirely. And there was a fourth, stranger note. The mud that flowed back up the borehole was, in the words of those who saw it, boiling with hydrogen gas, the deep rock releasing a constant breath of it. The ground itself was exhaling. Taken together, these were not trivia. They reshaped how scientists pictured the deep crust. Water, and even the chemical traces of ancient life, reached far lower than the models had allowed, hinting at a planet that is wetter and more chemically alive at depth than anyone had assumed. And the missing basalt carried a lesson far beyond Kola. One of the standard ways of reading the deep earth from the surface, by interpreting those sudden jumps in the speed of earthquake waves, had to be reconsidered everywhere, not just under one Arctic borehole. A single needle-thin hole had quietly corrected the picture of the ground beneath whole continents. But the deeper they pushed, the more the planet pushed back. The temperatures climbed far faster than the models said they should. Scientists had expected something around 100 degrees Celsius at the target depth. What they met instead, at 12 kilometers, was closer to 180. And at that heat, something happened that no amount of engineering could defeat. The rock stopped behaving like a solid. It became plastic, soft, slow, flowing, and it began to close the borehole around the drill as fast as the drill could cut, gripping the bit, sealing the wound the machine was trying to open. In 1989, the bore reached its deepest point, 12,262 meters, just over 12 kilometers. They tried to go further and could not. The hot, creeping rock defeated every attempt, and the deeper branches of the hole kept curving and jamming shut. Then history closed in from above. The Soviet Union came apart, the money vanished, and by 1992, the drilling stopped for good. The deepest hole humanity had ever made was abandoned and later capped, a rusted metal plate welded over a 23-centimetre wound in the Arctic ground. And for all of that, for the deepest hole in the history of the world, they had traveled only about a third of the way through the continental crust at that spot, never mind the mantle far beneath it. 2 decades of the most determined drilling ever attempted had carried them down the thickness of a coat of paint on a globe. The planet had let them in just far enough to overturn their textbooks, and not 1 meter farther than it chose to. Now, here is where the story splits in two. One path leading to the truth, the other to a lie that has traveled much farther. Because while real scientists were quietly publishing papers about deep water and ancient fossils, a very different version of Kola was being born. In 1989, an American religious broadcaster aired a sensational claim that scientists drilling in the region had broken through into a vast cavern, that the temperature there had spiked impossibly, and that, lowering a microphone into the hole, they had recorded the sound of countless human voices screaming in torment. The screams of the damned captured on tape, rising out of a literal hell beneath the earth. It was completely fabricated. The recording of tormented voices was later traced to looped sound effects, pieces of an old horror film soundtrack stitched together. The tale itself had wandered a strange road to get there, passing from that broadcast through a Norwegian traveler into a Finnish newsletter, and back again to American preachers who repeated it as fact, each retelling adding a layer of false authority. It was, in short, a hoax. There was no cavern, no microphone lowered into the abyss, no chorus of the damned. There was only a narrow scientific borehole and a story that people wanted to believe. And this is the quiet tragedy at the center of the whole thing. The lie was simple, and it spread across the world. The truth was extraordinary. A hidden sea trapped in stone, fossils from a planet 2 billion years younger, a rock layer that wasn't there, ground that breathed hydrogen, and heat so intense the Earth resealed itself. And almost no one has heard it. When most people remember Kola at all, they remember the screams that were never recorded, not the water that was really found. It is worth asking why the lie won so completely. Part of the answer is that the hoax offered a story, with a shape, a setting, and a moral, while the truth offered data, water content, fossil counts, a misread seismic boundary. A chorus of the damned is something you can picture in a single instant. A metamorphosed discontinuity in the deep crust is not. The deep earth handed us one of the great scientific results of the century, and it arrived in the language of papers and core samples that almost no one outside the field will ever read. The myth needed no evidence at all, and it traveled the world. The truth had mountains of evidence, and it stayed in the journals. As for the hole itself, it outlived the country that made it. After the drilling stopped, the research station was stripped and left to the Arctic, and in time, the borehole was sealed shut. Today, it is nothing to look at. A heavy, rusted metal cap bolted into a concrete pad, half lost in the tundra, the kind of thing a hiker would step over without a second glance. Beneath that saucer of metal, the deepest point humanity has ever reached waits in the dark, exactly as it was left. And no one has beaten it since. Some wells drilled for oil have run longer in total, snaking sideways for greater overall length, but straight down into the rock. Nothing human has ever gone deeper than Kola. More than 30 years on, the deepest place we have reached is still a hole in the Russian Arctic that the people who made it could not keep open. The wall they hit was not, in the end, a lack of money or nerve. It was the planet itself. The plain, unyielding fact that a dozen kilometers down, the Earth grows hot enough to close around anything we send into it. There is one more humbling fact to sit with. For all of that effort, 24 years, a record that may stand for generations. The Kola borehole reached just over 12 kilometers. The distance from the surface to the center of the Earth is more than 6,000. We did not pierce the crust. We did not come close. The deepest wound humanity has ever cut into its own planet did not even make it through the outer skin. We have stood on the moon, and we have never touched the world beneath our feet. If that gap fascinates you, between what we reached for and what we actually reached, subscribe, and you will get a new entry from the archive every Sunday. In a frozen part of the Soviet Arctic, over 24 years, human beings drilled the deepest hole ever made. 12,262 meters of narrow bore into ancient rock. Down there, they found water that should not exist, the fossils of life 2 billion years old, the absence of a rock layer the textbooks had promised, and a ground that exhaled hydrogen. They did not find a cavern or a microphone's recording of the damned. That story was invented, far from Kola, out of sound effects and faith. And they stopped, not because they reached anything monstrous, but because the planet grew too hot and too soft to be opened any further. Everything else, the screams, the gateway, the hell beneath the ice, was a story humans told because it was easier to imagine than the real thing. A sealed plate of rusting metal in the tundra, a needle-thin hole no wider than a saucer, and beneath it the deepest place we have ever reached. Silent, dark, 2 billion years old, and still only the faintest scratch on the surface of a world we have barely begun to read.